The screams echoed through the Willowbrook Community Center like shattered glass, piercing the peaceful Saturday afternoon silence. 10-year-old Jamal Williams lay crumpled at the bottom of the concrete staircase. His wheelchair twisted beside him like a broken bird, one wheel spinning lazily in the afternoon sun that streamed through the skylights above. "Oh my God! Somebody call 911. The voice belonged to Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who had been tending to the community garden just moments before. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone, the watering can still clutched in her other hand, water spilling onto the concrete like tears. Above them, standing at the top of the stairs with her arms crossed and her face twisted in righteous indignation, stood Karen Mitchell. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair remained unmoved despite the chaos below, her manicured nails drumming against her designer purse as she surveyed the scene with cold satisfaction. "I told him to leave," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been challenged in her life. The wheelchair was scratching the floors. This is what happens when people don't listen. The words hung in the air like poison, and suddenly the small crowd that had gathered felt the weight of what they had just witnessed. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a child who had simply fallen. This was something far more sinister, something that would shake the very foundations of their quiet suburban community. Jamal had been coming to the community center every Saturday for the past 3 months. It had become his ritual, his escape from the confines of his bedroom where he spent most of his time during the week. The rec room on the second floor had become his sanctuary, a place where he could forget about the stares, the whispers, the way people looked at him like he was broken. He loved the board games. Chess, Monopoly, Scrabble, anything that allowed his mind to soar beyond the limitations of his body. The accident that had left him paralyzed from the waist down 2 years ago had taken away his ability to run and play like other kids. But it hadn't touched his sharp intellect, or his infectious laugh that could light up a room. Every Saturday morning, his mother would drop him off at 10 a.m. sharp, and he would spend the next 4 hours lost in games and puzzles, sometimes playing alone, sometimes with other kids who had gradually warmed up to him. The community center was supposed to be a safe space, a place where everyone was welcome regardless of age, race, or ability. But Karen Mitchell had other ideas. She had been the self-appointed guardian of the community center for the past 5 years, ever since she had bullied her way onto the HOA board with promises of maintaining standards and preserving property values. At 52, she had perfected the art of passive-aggressive warfare, wielding her authority like a weapon against anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of acceptable. The first time she had encountered Jamal, she had watched him navigate the hallways with barely concealed disgust. She had complained to the maintenance staff about scuff marks on the newly waxed floors, demanded that they install additional signage about proper use of facilities, and had even suggested that certain individuals might be better served at more appropriate venues. But her complaints had fallen on deaf ears. The community center was public property, funded by taxpayer dollars, and no one had the authority to bar a child from using it simply because he used a wheelchair. This had only fueled her resentment, her sense that the natural order of things was being disrupted by people who didn't understand their place. Today, she had decided to take matters into her own hands. Jamal had been making his way to the elevator after a particularly satisfying game of chess with Mr. Rodriguez, the retired teacher who volunteered at the center. He had won 3 games in a row, and his spirits were high as he maneuvered his wheelchair through the corridor, already planning his strategy for next week's match. That's when Karen had appeared, blocking his path like a human wall. "You need to leave," she had said, her voice sharp and commanding. "The wheelchair is damaging the floors. This is a community facility, not a hospital." Jamal had looked up at her with confusion, his dark eyes wide with the kind of innocent bewilderment that only children possess when confronted with adult cruelty they cannot comprehend. But, but I'm not doing anything wrong, he had stammered, his voice small and uncertain. I just want to go to the elevator. Don't talk back to me, Karen had snapped, stepping closer. I'm on the HOA board, and I'm telling you to leave. Now. The confrontation had drawn attention from other visitors to the center. Mrs. Chen, who had been reading in the corner, looked up from her book with concern. Two teenagers playing ping pong had stopped mid-game to stare. Even the maintenance worker, Jose, had paused in his mopping to watch the scene unfold. Jamal had tried to wheel around her, his small hands gripping the rims of his wheels as he attempted to navigate toward the elevator. But Karen had moved with him, continuing to block his path, her face growing redder with each passing second. You're not listening to me, she had hissed, her voice rising to a pitch that made everyone in the vicinity uncomfortable. I said leave. And then, in a moment that would haunt the witnesses for years to come, Karen had placed her hands on the back of Jamal's wheelchair and pushed. Hard. The chair had rocketed forward, completely out of control, carrying the terrified boy toward the staircase that led to the main floor. Jamal's desperate cries for help had echoed through the building as he fought to regain control, his small hands frantically working the brakes that weren't designed for such velocity. But it was too late. The wheelchair had hit the top step and launched into the air, carrying Jamal with it in a grotesque ballet of twisted metal and flailing limbs. He had tumbled down the concrete stairs, each impact sending shockwaves through the horrified onlookers, until he finally came to rest at the bottom, motionless and eerily quiet. Now, as the sirens wailed in the distance and neighbors rushed to the scene, the true magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. This wasn't just an assault on a child. It was an attack on the very values that held their community together. Marcus Johnson, a carpenter who lived 3 blocks away, had been the first to reach Jamal. He knelt beside the boy, checking for signs of life while being careful not to move him in case of spinal injuries. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was a child who had already survived one life-altering accident, only to be deliberately harmed by an adult who was supposed to protect him. "Hey there, buddy," Marcus whispered, his voice gentle despite the rage building in his chest. "You're going to be okay. Help is coming." Jamal's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and filled with pain. A thin trickle of blood ran from his forehead, and his left arm was bent at an unnatural angle. But he was conscious, and that was what mattered most. I want my mom," Jamal whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing commotion. "She's coming," Marcus assured him, though he had no idea if that was true. "Just stay still. Okay? Don't try to move." The paramedics arrived within minutes, their professional efficiency cutting through the chaos like a blade. They worked quickly and methodically, stabilizing Jamal's neck, checking his vital signs, and preparing him for transport to the hospital. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the boy who had just been laughing and playing chess was loaded onto a stretcher, his small body dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding him. Throughout it all, Karen remained at the top of the stairs, her arms still crossed, her expression one of stubborn defiance. She seemed completely oblivious to the horror of what she had done. Or perhaps she simply didn't care. To her, this was justice, the natural consequence of challenging her authority. But the community was watching, and they were recording. Sarah Kim, a local journalist who had been at the center researching a story about community programs, had captured the entire incident on her phone. The video was shaky, and the audio was chaotic. But the essential facts were clear. Karen Mitchell had deliberately pushed a disabled child down a flight of stairs. As the ambulance pulled away, its sirens fading into the distance, the crowd began to disperse. But the conversations that started that day would continue for weeks, spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. People who had never spoken to each other before found themselves united in their outrage, their disbelief, their determination to ensure that justice was served. Dr. Angela Williams received the call at her downtown law office at 3:47 p.m. She had been reviewing depositions for a discrimination case when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. For a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. Dr. Williams, this is Dr. Martinez at Children's Hospital. I'm calling about your son, Jamal. He's been involved in an incident at the community center. The words hit her like a physical blow. Angela had built her career on staying composed under pressure, on maintaining her professional demeanor even in the face of the most challenging cases. But this was different. This was her baby, her miracle child, who had already overcome so much. She arrived at the hospital in record time, her mind racing through every possible scenario. Jamal was stable, the doctors assured her, but he had suffered a concussion, a broken arm, and multiple bruises and lacerations. It could have been much worse, a fact that both comforted and terrified her. As she sat beside his hospital bed, watching him sleep off the effects of the pain medication, Angela felt something she hadn't experienced in years: powerlessness. She had dedicated her life to fighting for the rights of people with disabilities, to ensuring that they could live with dignity and independence. She had won landmark cases, changed laws, and inspired a generation of advocates. But she couldn't protect her own son from the cruelty of a woman who saw him as less than human. The next morning brought a parade of visitors to Jamal's hospital room. Friends from school, neighbors from the community, and even strangers who had heard about the incident came to offer their support. The room was filled with flowers, balloons, and get-well cards, transforming the sterile medical environment into something warm and hopeful. Among the visitors was Marcus Johnson, the carpenter who had been first to reach Jamal after the fall. He had brought a small wooden chess set that he had carved himself, each piece a work of art that reflected his skill and care. "I heard you're pretty good at chess," Marcus said, setting the board on the hospital table. "Maybe when you're feeling better, you can teach me a few moves." Jamal's face lit up with the first genuine smile Angela had seen since the accident. Despite his injuries, despite the trauma he had endured, her son's spirit remained unbroken. "Did you really make this?" Jamal asked, running his good hand over the smooth wooden pieces. "It's beautiful. Every piece," Marcus confirmed. "Just like you. It's one of a kind." The comment was simple, but it carried weight that both Angela and Jamal understood. In a world that often saw disability as a deficit, Marcus was affirming Jamal's worth, his uniqueness, his value as a human being. As the day progressed, Angela began to learn more about what had happened at the community center. The witnesses came forward one by one, sharing their accounts of Karen's behavior, her history of complaints, and the deliberate nature of her actions. Each story added another layer to the picture of systematic harassment and discrimination. But it was Sarah Kim's video that would prove to be the game changer. The footage was disturbing to watch, even for someone who had seen the worst of human behavior in her legal practice. Karen's face was clearly visible as she pushed Jamal's wheelchair, her expression one of cold determination. The audio captured her threatening words, her dismissive attitude, and the horrifying sound of the wheelchair crashing down the stairs. "I want to use this," Angela told Sarah, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest. "I want everyone to see what she did to my son." "Are you sure?" Sarah asked gently. Once this goes public, there's no taking it back. It's going to be everywhere. Angela looked at her son, sleeping peacefully in his hospital bed, his arm in a cast, and his forehead marked with stitches. He was the strongest person she knew, and he deserved to have his story told. "He's not just my son," she said finally. "He's part of this community. And this community needs to know what kind of person they've put in charge of their affairs." The revelation of Angela's professional identity sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Dr. Angela Williams wasn't just any concerned parent. She was one of the most respected disability rights attorneys in the state, a woman who had successfully challenged major corporations, government agencies, and institutions on behalf of her clients. Karen Mitchell had picked the wrong child to target and the wrong family to torment. The news spread quickly through the community, carried by social media, text messages, and good old-fashioned word of mouth. People who had been quietly uncomfortable with Karen's behavior suddenly found their voices, sharing stories of her past actions, her pattern of discrimination, and her abuse of power. There was the Hispanic family whose children had been banned from the community pool because they were too loud. The elderly black man who had been harassed for walking his dog in the wrong area of the neighborhood. The young mother whose daughter had been told she couldn't use the playground because her clothing was inappropriate. Each story painted a picture of a woman who had systematically used her position to enforce her own prejudices, to exclude and intimidate anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision of what the community should look like. But the attack on Jamal was different. This time, Karen had crossed a line that the community couldn't ignore. The HOA board called an emergency meeting for the following Thursday evening. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and by the time the meeting began, the community center was packed beyond capacity. People stood in the aisles, lined the walls, and spilled out into the parking lot where speakers had been hastily set up to accommodate the overflow crowd. Angela arrived with Jamal, who insisted on attending despite his injuries. He sat in his wheelchair beside his mother, his cast decorated with signatures and messages from his supporters, his head held high despite the bandages that covered his stitches. The meeting was supposed to follow standard procedures, but nothing about this evening was standard. The room crackled with tension, anger, and determination. People who had never spoken at a public meeting before had prepared statements. Others had brought signs, banners, and photographs that told the story of their community's diversity and strength. Karen sat at the board table, flanked by her attorney and two other board members who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the crowd grew larger and more vocal. She had prepared her own statement, one that painted her as the victim of a misunderstanding, a dedicated volunteer who had simply been trying to maintain community standards. But the video spoke louder than her words. When Sarah Kim stood up to present her footage, the room fell silent. The large screen at the front of the room flickered to life, and suddenly, everyone could see exactly what had happened that Saturday afternoon. The audio was clear, the video was sharp, and the evidence was undeniable. Karen's face went pale as she watched herself on screen, her actions exposed to the entire community. She had tried to control the narrative, to paint herself as the reasonable adult dealing with a difficult situation. But the video showed the truth, a grown woman deliberately harming a child because of his disability. The room erupted in outrage. People stood up, shouting their disgust, their anger, their demands for justice. The board president, a mild-mannered accountant named Robert Chen, pounded his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. "This is unacceptable," shouted Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who had called 911. "We trusted this woman to represent our community, and she's turned us into accomplices to child abuse. She needs to be removed from the board immediately," added Marcus Johnson, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had helped save Jamal's life. The calls for Karen's removal were joined by demands for her prosecution, her censure, and her banishment from the community. People who had been silent for years suddenly found their voices, united in their determination to ensure that nothing like this ever happened again. Finally, Angela stood up. The room fell silent, recognizing that this was the moment they had been waiting for. She looked around at the faces of her neighbors, people who had come together to support her son and to stand up for what was right. 2 years ago, my son was in a car accident that changed his life forever, she began, her voice clear and strong. He lost the use of his legs, but he didn't lose his spirit, his intelligence, or his right to be treated with dignity and respect. The room was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. Every eye was focused on Angela, every ear tuned to her words. Jamal comes to this community center because it's supposed to be a safe place, a place where all children can play and learn and grow. Instead, he was attacked by an adult who saw his disability as a threat to her narrow vision of what our community should look like. She paused, looking directly at Karen, who was staring down at her hands, unable to meet her gaze. "This isn't just about my son," Angela continued. "This is about the kind of community we want to be. Do we want to be a place where children are welcomed and protected? Or do we want to be a place where prejudice and hatred are allowed to flourish?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. And one by one, people began to stand up. First Marcus, then Mrs. Peterson, then the teenagers who had witnessed the attack, then dozens of others until the entire room was on its feet, applauding not just for Angela's words, but for the courage to finally confront the poison that had been festering in their community. The board's vote was unanimous. Karen Mitchell was immediately removed from her position and banned from all community facilities. The police were called, and she was arrested on charges of assault, child endangerment, and civil rights violations. But the community's response went far beyond punishment. In the weeks that followed, they implemented new policies that made their facilities more accessible, created programs specifically designed to welcome children with disabilities, and established a diversity committee to ensure that everyone felt safe and included. Jamal's recovery was slow, but steady. The physical injuries healed, but the emotional scars took longer to fade. He had nightmares about falling, anxiety about returning to public spaces, and moments of doubt about whether he truly belonged in the community he had thought of as home. But the outpouring of support from his neighbors helped him heal in ways that medicine couldn't. The chess club that formed around his hospital bed continued to meet even after he was discharged. Marcus taught him woodworking, helping him create beautiful pieces despite his limited mobility. Mrs. Peterson invited him to help with the community garden, designing raised beds that were accessible to wheelchair users. Most importantly, the community made sure that Jamal knew he was valued, not despite his disability, but as a complete person who had something unique to contribute. The legal proceedings against Karen were swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence and public pressure, she pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 2 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution for Jamal's medical expenses and to complete community service focused on disability awareness. Her house, which she had been forced to sell to pay legal fees and settlements, was purchased by a young family with a daughter who used a wheelchair. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the community. The woman who had tried to exclude disabled children from their neighborhood had been replaced by a family who would ensure that accessibility and inclusion remained priorities. 6 months after the incident, the community center hosted its first annual Unity Day, a celebration of diversity and inclusion that drew people from across the city. Jamal served as the honorary chairman, his infectious smile and boundless enthusiasm inspiring everyone who met him. The event featured adaptive games, wheelchair basketball demonstrations, and presentations by local disability advocates. But the highlight was the chess tournament, where Jamal faced off against players of all ages and abilities, his strategic mind and competitive spirit earning him victory after victory. As the sun set on that perfect day, Angela watched her son surrounded by friends and neighbors, his laughter echoing through the same building where he had once been attacked. The community that had failed to protect him had transformed itself into something stronger, more inclusive, and more compassionate. The story of Jamal Williams and Karen Mitchell became a cautionary tale that spread far beyond their small community. It was shared on social media, discussed in schools, and referenced in training programs for public officials. But for the people who lived through it, it was something more than just a story. It was a reminder of the power of ordinary people to stand up against injustice and create change. The new HOA board, elected in a landslide victory by residents who had been energized by the events of that summer, implemented policies that went far beyond simple compliance with disability laws. They created mentorship programs, accessibility audits, and community forums that ensured every voice was heard and valued. The community center was renovated with universal design principles, creating spaces that were welcoming to people of all abilities. The chess room was renamed in Jamal's honor, and a scholarship fund was established to support children with disabilities who wanted to participate in recreational activities. But perhaps the most important change was in the hearts and minds of the people who called this place home. They had learned that true community isn't about maintaining artificial standards or excluding those who are different. It's about creating a place where everyone can thrive, where children can grow up without fear, and where the measure of a person's worth isn't determined by their physical abilities or the color of their skin. 2 years later, Jamal was thriving. He had become a youth advocate, speaking at schools and community events about disability rights and inclusion. His chess skills had earned him a spot on the state championship team, and his woodworking projects, created with Marcus's patient guidance, were displayed in local galleries. The scars on his forehead had faded, but the memory of that terrible day remained, not as a source of trauma, but as a reminder of his own strength and the power of a community united in purpose. Angela had used the incident as inspiration for her most ambitious project yet, a national campaign to reform HOA governance and ensure that discrimination in community associations was met with swift and decisive action. The Jamal's Law initiative had gained support from legislators across the country, promising to create real consequences for those who abused their power to harm vulnerable residents. On the 3rd anniversary of the incident, the community gathered at the center for a special ceremony. A bronze plaque was unveiled near the entrance, bearing Jamal's likeness and the words, "In recognition of the courage of a child who reminded us that true strength comes not from exclusion, but from inclusion." As Jamal read the inscription, surrounded by the people who had become his extended family, he felt a deep sense of pride and purpose. The woman who had tried to destroy him had ultimately made him stronger, and the community that had failed to protect him had learned to be better. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the crowded room. "Thank you for showing me that I belong here, not because of what I can't do, but because of who I am." The applause was thunderous, but it was the quiet moments that followed that truly mattered. As the crowd dispersed and the evening grew quiet, families walked home together, children played in the newly accessible playground, and neighbors chatted on porches that had once been divided by suspicion and prejudice. The transformation wasn't complete. Change is always a work in progress. But something fundamental had shifted in the hearts of the people who lived in this place. They had learned that a community is only as strong as its most vulnerable members, and that true security comes not from excluding those who are different, but from embracing them. Karen Mitchell's name was rarely mentioned anymore, except as a cautionary tale told to new residents about the importance of treating all neighbors with respect. She had served her sentence and moved to another state, her dream of controlling her perfect suburban enclave shattered by the courage of a 10-year-old boy who refused to be silenced. But Jamal's name lived on, spoken with pride and affection by people who had watched him grow from a frightened child in a hospital bed to a confident young man who had changed their community for the better. His story reminded them that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, and that sometimes the smallest voice can create the biggest change. As the years passed, new families moved into the neighborhood, drawn by its reputation for inclusivity and community spirit. They heard the story of Jamal Williams and Karen Mitchell, and they understood that they were inheriting not just a place to live, but a legacy of standing up for what's right. The community center continued to thrive, its programs expanding to serve people of all ages and abilities. The chess club that had grown around Jamal's hospital bed had become a regional powerhouse, attracting players from across the state. The woodworking program had created a cottage industry of beautiful, accessible furniture that was sold to support the center's programs. And every Saturday, without fail, Jamal could be found in the rec room, teaching chess to new players, sharing stories about perseverance and inclusion, and reminding everyone who met him that disabilities don't define people. Courage, kindness, and determination do. The concrete stairs where he had fallen were still there, but they were no longer a symbol of trauma. They had been transformed into a memorial garden, with beautiful plantings and a bench where people could sit and reflect on the lessons learned from that terrible day. A small fountain bubbled nearby, its gentle sound a reminder that even the hardest surfaces can be softened by patience and care. Children who were too young to remember the incident would ask their parents about the bronze plaque, and they would hear the story of how their community had learned to be better. They would learn that standing up for others isn't always easy, but it's always right. They would understand that true strength comes not from having power over others, but from using whatever power you have to lift others up. The story of Jamal Williams and the community that rose to defend him became more than just a local legend. It became a blueprint for how neighborhoods can transform themselves in the face of injustice. It showed that ordinary people, when united by a common purpose, can create extraordinary change. And in the end, that may be the most important lesson of all, that communities aren't built by the people who exclude and divide, but by those who include and unite. They're built by children who refuse to be silenced, by adults who refuse to look away, and by neighbors who understand that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. The screams that had once echoed through the Willowbrook Community Center had been replaced by laughter, conversation, and the sound of a community that had learned to be worthy of its most vulnerable members. And in that transformation, everyone had found something precious, the understanding that true belonging isn't about fitting in, but about being accepted for exactly who you are. Jamal Williams had taught them that lesson the hard way, but the learning had been worth it. And as the sun set each day on their transformed community, they knew that the boy who had been pushed down the stairs had ultimately lifted all of them up.